never think of yourself as too small to make change. And this is a very big issue for a lot of young people that I speak to. They feel that the macro issue is just so big. The crises are so big. Climate crisis is so big. There's nothing I can do. And I think that's a big mistake. As an individual, as a small group, there's a lot one can do in one's own individual lives, consumption, etc., but also with groups in your own social economic setup, and then linking with others, like I said. So one is never think of yourself as too small.
Welcome back to another episode of the Protect the World podcast. Every month, I connect with a different not-for-profit organisation that's making the world a better place. My goal is to learn about the issues they're tackling, interview the founder or director, and then share their stories with you. But I don't just want to share their stories. I want to contribute to their work as well. If you'd like to help me, you can sign up to the Patreon via the link in the show notes. The voice you heard at the beginning of this podcast belongs to Ashish Kothari. He's one of the founding members of Kalpavriksh, a not-for-profit environmental action group striving for ecological sustainability and social equity in India. Kalpavriksh has a fully democratic, non-hierarchical governance structure, so it would be incorrect to call Ashish the director. However, he has been heavily involved in the organisation throughout its 44-year history. In this episode, I speak to Ashish about the changes he's witnessed in India over the course of his career, some of the inspiring movements he's been a part of, and his vision, or should I say visions, for the future. Ashish is someone who has spent his entire career standing on the front lines alongside a range of social and ecological justice movements in India, whilst simultaneously thinking deeply about what it would mean for humans to live meaningful lives within the finite boundaries of our planet. He's worked in the ecological, economic, sociocultural, and political spheres at local, national, and international levels, and has a remarkable understanding of inequality and biodiversity in India and abroad. I'm very grateful to Ashish for sharing his time and knowledge throughout this conversation, and I hope you learn as much from it as I did. So now I bring you Ashish Kothari, founding member of Kalpavriksh. Ashish Kothari, a very warm welcome to the Protect the World podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm well, thanks for having me, Brody. Thanks a lot.
I want to start by asking, who are you and how do you describe yourself?
Okay, so my name is Ashish Kothari. I'm based in India, in the city of Pune. And I work with several institutions and organizations and networks. The longest standing being Kalpavriksh, which is a environmental action group that started in 1979 when some of us were in school or college. And but also a national network called Vikalp Sangam, which means the confluence of alternatives, and the a global network called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. So there's a bunch of things, and also have been on the boards of Greenpeace International and Greenpeace India, and helped to start a network called the ICCA Consortium, or the Territories of Life Consortium, which is also a global network of indigenous peoples, communities, civil society organizations, basically trying to protect and sustain natural territories, biocultural territories where these communities live. So yeah, a few things.
Incredible. You sound like a busy man. We'll get to, I want to talk about alternatives and also your work internationally and that kind of thing. But to start with, tell me about Kalpavriksh. How would you describe your mission as an organization?
Well, back in 1978-79, when we started, our focus was on nature. The word Kalpavriksh itself is from ancient Indian mythology of a wish-fulfilling tree, kind of similar to the wish-fulfilling well, wishing well of Christianity. And our aim was to say that if nature is actually providing us everything we need, we should also be respecting and protecting nature. That's how we started, but then we kind of broadened our focus from there to other environmental issues, then of course, then the connected ecological, economic, political, social, cultural issues of governance, of economic models of development, cultural and language diversity, and a whole bunch of other things. So it's a very broad focus, but still very much focused on environment defined in a very expanded, broad sense. And we work on alternative education relating to the environment. We work on campaigns. We work on looking at alternatives, helping ground level movements, especially movements that are trying to resist destructive forms of development, creating awareness, producing material. Yeah, so many different things.
Fantastic. Could you give an example of one of those movements that you're supporting?
Yeah, sure. We have, for the last few decades, for instance, we've been supporting ground level movements against large hydroelectricity projects and irrigation dams, which cause a lot of displacement and dispossession. Millions of people have been actually displaced, physically uprooted from their lands because of these projects. So that's been one focus for quite some time now. Similarly, struggles against mining or extractivist projects. And the one that's recently in the news, it's national news, probably global news, is where a tunnel that was under construction for road construction in the Himalaya, which is also very, very disastrous. Several dozen workers have actually got trapped inside, and there's an attempt to try and rescue them. But what that has really brought up is that the Himalaya are extremely fragile, and that kind of infrastructure development is just not it's not advisable. So basically, when we support these sorts of movements on the ground, we also raise issues about what really is development, what is the kind of pathways of well-being that we want in India, and it's clearly not the ones that this large-scale infrastructure kind of development or industrial development that our government is pushing. But that's the kind of and the second example I gave was of protected areas, the Western model of conservation, in which people are shifted out of their natural ecosystems, and the government takes over and says we will protect wildlife. And we have been basically supporting movements that say that, of course, wildlife has to be protected, but with and by the people who live there, who lived there for centuries, and not by centralized bureaucracies. So these are some examples of kinds of movements we support.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm keen to talk to you both about that concept of development as well as your community conserved areas. But just to start, I'm fairly sure that Kalpavriksh is the longest running organization that I've featured on this podcast. Could you tell me a little bit about the history and how it all started?
Well, back in New Delhi, when some of us were in school or in college, I was in high school. There were sort of a bunch of maybe 5-6 kids who were interested in different kinds of things. Some were interested in nature and wildlife, some in animal rights, some in issues of pollution, some human rights. And we initially started by doing a couple of small actions on hunting, wildlife hunting, and trade in monkeys from India to the US. And when we did that, we also got aware of the fact that one of the largest city forests in the world, which is in New Delhi, called the Delhi Ridge Forest, it's about 7,000 hectares of forest area, was being increasingly threatened by construction, by road widening, etc., urbanization, essentially. And we felt that that forest is very important for Delhi, for us, for our health, for the air of Delhi, and also, of course, for the wildlife that it contained, and for being a sort of natural open-air classroom for students who want to learn biology or ecology or whatever. And so we took up a campaign of that destruction. And this was back in 1978, 79. And the campaign involved street actions. It involved going and giving memoranda to the government, to the Prime Minister, and a whole bunch of other things. And that's when we said that it will be good to try and do this more systematically through an organization. So that's how Kalpavriksh was formed in 1979. And basically just school and college students mostly who started this off. So that was our first steps. And then from there, we kind of progressed into wider and wider issues.
Yeah, I'd like to hear a bit about that journey, but actually, first, I want to talk about the journey that sort of India has been on during that period. Could you tell me a bit about the changes you've witnessed in India over your lifetime?
Well, so I was born in 1961, and I think the 1950s and 60s were a period of India trying to consolidate what it felt was the appropriate development journey and the appropriate democratic governance system for a country as diverse and as big as we were. And of course, in the 1960s, I was too young to think about it, but already at that stage, there were some people and movements that were beginning to ask the question of what is the right method of or pathway of development in India. Even during the independence struggle in the 1930s and 40s, Mahatma Gandhi had already been talking about a very different form of, he didn't even call it development, a different form of what India should be doing to get out of poverty, to get out of caste and gender inequalities and things like that. And his vision was much more about rural revival, rural reconstruction, focusing on villages, which is where most of India lived at that point in time. Whereas the government that took over after India gained independence under Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru, their focus was much more on sort of a somewhat Western way of looking at development with large-scale industrialization and infrastructure development, etc. In any case, so that's the first sort of 2 or 3 decades. But even at that point in time, it was very clear that India wanted to take a relatively socialist pathway. That is to say that a lot of the development was led and supported by government, by the public sector, and not really by the private sector. And to some extent, of course, a lot of social welfare schemes that the government sort of promoted and promised. We had that for a few decades. Around the 1970s, a lot of groups started asking the question of what about the impacts on environment? Because with this kind of large-scale infrastructure, like with dams that I mentioned earlier, we had, of course, a lot of damage taking place. And so these movements, for instance, one of the most iconic in the 1970s was the so-called Chipko movement. Chipko means to hug.
Fun fact, this movement, alongside a similar historical example from India's Bishnoi community, is where the term tree hugger comes from.
Which is a movement in the Himalaya that essentially village women led, saying that we won't allow our trees to be cut for commercial timber because these trees are crucial for our livelihoods and they are our brothers. And so that was really a very sort of a wake-up call, an inspiring moment for all the rest of us, and in fact for many movements around the world. There were similar movements against big dams and against mining by traditional fisher communities, against commercial large-scale trawling that was coming in, etc. So because of these movements, and because also there was some interest within the government, we saw in the 1970s and 80s the development of several policies and laws on environmental issues. And that's so many of us growing up at that point in time, and then we formed Kalpavriksh, we felt this was a period in which there was at least some attempt to try and balance so-called development and environment and human rights. But that was very positive in those 2 decades. Then in 1991, our government decided it wanted to basically abandon the socialist model of development. It wasn't fully socialist, but to some extent at least, and to enter into the economic globalization processes that were already underway in some other parts of the world, like Southeast Asia had already entered that in the 1970s and 80s, but India had kind of resisted. 1991, it was opened up. We had the so-called economic reforms, which I call deforms. But basically, that meant much more privatization, much more investments by multinational corporations from outside, the possibility for Indian corporations to become very big, much greater or much more relaxation of both human rights and labor and environmental laws that had been hard fought during the 70s and 80s, and a lot more attempt at trying to sell India as a place for commercial and capitalist profit making. So that's 1991 onwards, and we actually, a colleague and I did a book in 2012 looking at 20 years of that period and the kind of damage, social, ecological, economic damage that it had caused.
That book is called Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India, and I'll put a link in the show notes for anyone interested.
We are still in that phase. We are still in a phase in which this present government has actually taken that much further in terms of privatization, in terms of what we can call crony capitalism, and basically a much larger attack on civil rights, democratic rights, against dissent, democratic dissent, which the previous government was a bit soft on, but this particular government is very, very harsh. So that's, in a bit of a nutshell, the history of the last few decades of India, especially looking at environment and human rights. So we are currently possibly in the worst possible phase of our development trajectory from these points of view.
Wow, that was an incredible summary. Thank you. What would you say have been the defining moments for Kalpavriksh during that period, that last sort of 4 decades since you've been running?
Yeah, so I'm sure other members will have other things to say, but from my perspective, I think one of the most important periods was the first 4 or 5 years, because from a focus on protecting forests in Delhi or some wildlife nature conservation kind of things, as we got in touch with a lot of movements, such as the Chipko movement that I mentioned, or the fish workers movement, or the anti-mining movements and the anti-dam movements, we realized that these were issues that were inextricably connected to economic policy, macroeconomics, who's determining economic policy, and political governance, who is taking decisions, who has control over India's nature and natural resources, or decisions that affect nature and natural resources. And so the political and economic issues kind of became also very central. And so I think these first 4 or 5 years were really a very steep learning curve for us. And becoming involved with movements meant that we were also, in some senses, grounding ourselves to the extent it was possible for an urban group to do that, grounding ourselves in what sort of ground reality there was and the struggles of peoples. And I think the most important lesson from that period that has still stayed with us is that we cannot separate whatever's happening to the rest of nature from whatever's happening in the human world, right? So therefore, the economic, political issues, etc. A bit later in the day, I think we also kind of realized that some of the social and cultural issues that India is grappling with, or the world is grappling with, are also crucial. These could be gender issues. They could be, in India's case, of course, casteism. I have to admit that we were rather late in coming into the connections between casteism and nature and environment, but now we realize that it's very important. It could be things like disability or so-called disability and the connections with the environment, etc. So really trying to understand also the socio-cultural milieu and the changes taking place in the socio-cultural milieu of India and the environment. So that's a little bit more recent. I think already in the early 80s, we were beginning to ask this question of what is development. And this was in particular in relation to one hydroelectricity, not one dam, but one series of projects on the central Indian river called Narmada, which has in fact been one of the most iconic movements across the world, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, or the Save the Narmada River movement, which has spawned similar movements all over the world against a series of hydroelectricity and irrigation dams on that river. And so we got involved actually in 1983 as students when we did a 50-day walk along the river and brought out a report asking, is this destruction a development or destruction? In 1985, the movement really started in earnest, and we kind of joined that on the ground. And so the question was already there in our minds, but I think 1991, 92 onwards, when we, as I said, this phase of economic globalization really began to hit India in a much bigger way, we sharpened that question, and we kind of head-on said, this is not development. It's not for the well-being of people. It's for the well-being of maybe a few profit makers and some politicians who want to remain in power. And maybe a handful of India's, small percentage of India's population that will become rich, but not in the interests of a large number of people, and also definitely not in a long-term interest in terms of ecological sustainability of the country. So that was, I would say, 91, 92 onwards. Around also the 80s and 90s, we got involved with a number of global movements. Till then, I think there was a lot of focus on India. But then we increased, and especially with economic globalization, we realized that it's, India, whatever India does negatively or positively has to be linked to what's happening outside. And having connections with community conservation movements outside or movements against big dams and extractivism, we developed a lot of sort of networks globally. So that was another sort of stepping stone in terms of widening our horizons beyond India as a political entity. Also looking at more stuff in South Asia, because we more and more realize that the political boundaries that separate India from Pakistan and Bangladesh and Bhutan and Nepal and Tibet and so on are artificial boundaries. They don't respect natural flows and cultural flows. So how do we reach across to groups and people out in those other countries to see, can we think of ourselves as South Asia, not just as India? And then finally, I would say that maybe two other things. One is also right from the beginning, we realized that for us as people as students who are growing up in formal education systems in India, the opportunity to learn about ecological and cultural issues was rare. If we happened to be in a school that had that kind of a outlook, good, like I did, I was fortunate. But for most students, it was a very top-down, very stilted, very straight-jacketed education system. And in many cases, for instance, for the indigenous peoples of India, their children were sort of taken out of their cultural and ecological context and put into government schools where the teaching was very alienated from their own surrounds, from their own communities. So one of our focus areas also then became much more ecologically and culturally rooted education, non-formal forms of education. And the final, I think, very important thing for us was over the last maybe decade, 12, 13 years, is the realization that as we keep supporting the struggles against destructive development and top-down governance and so on, we also need to work much more systematically at alternatives. What's emerging from the ground? What are the sorts of conceptual things that could emerge? And that is sort of one of the important phases that Kalpavriksh took on.
That is an incredible journey from those sort of humble origins, and it's a story that I hear quite a lot of people wanting to help nature and then quickly getting caught up in the complexity of it all and realizing that, yeah, it's not just about focusing on nature, it's about recognizing those political and economic systems that affect it. Tell me about the present day. Could you give me an overview of the main programs that Kalpavriksh is working on at the moment, and what does day-to-day of the organization look like?
Well, different parts of the organization maybe have different day-to-day experiences, but broadly, we have currently three thematic focus areas. One, which has been possibly the earliest, is conservation and livelihoods. So looking at nature conservation, but also from the point of view of the livelihood rights and the political rights of communities that are living amidst natural ecosystems. And therefore, a shift away from, or saying the formal Western protected area model is not appropriate. We need to shift to community-led conservation, what we then started calling community conserved areas in the 1980s, and then that became the global movement, which we initiated back in the late 80s, early 90s, which became then ICCAs, or Indigenous Peoples and Community Conserved Territories and Areas, and now it's called Territories of Life. And we're still very much a very central part of a global network that was started in early 2000s called ICCA Consortium. So that was that's one sort of area of work. The second area of, and that also includes a very important law that came in 2006 in India called the Forest Rights Act. So this was an attempt to try and reverse 200 years of colonial history in which the British colonial government had taken over control of most of India's forests away from communities that used to manage them. So this was a law that actually recognized that historical injustice and said that we now recognize that communities who have been traditionally dependent on or managing these forests have the right to claim them back for governance, for use, for sustainable use, etc. So that's a very, very crucial law, and that's also something we work on, trying to help communities on the ground who are actually trying to claim these rights. And that's not easy because the same government that passed the law is also resisting its implementation. As you know, governments are not a single unitary kind of thing, right? There are some elements that are much more progressive and they fight to bring these laws in with the ground support, but there are others who kind of would like to much rather retain their centralized control, including in this case, the Forest Department, which is carrying on from the British times. Anyway, so this is one big theme. The second major theme, which also started when the organization started, was environmental education. As I explained earlier, education that's not the same as what's being the conventional forms that are in our schools and colleges, but alternative forms of education, non-formal education, learning opportunities for, especially for children, which connect them back to their ecological and cultural roots. And that includes now a whole series of, I think, really wonderful children's books on nature, environment, conservation. I think we have about 20 titles by now, which my colleagues have been working on. The third, we used to have a thematic focus on urban environment for many years, because as I mentioned in our history, that is how we started looking at trying to protect the forests of New Delhi. And then we did a lot of that when we shifted our base to Pune, which is where I am right now. We had something called the Pune Tree Watch, which was trying to empower citizens to know what action they can take if they see trees being felled in their area. But a lot of that has kind of now become weaker, and we don't really have an urban program. The fourth program, again, which we had, which we're a little bit, there's some element of that going on, but it's not really full-fledged, is environment and development. This was the focus on supporting ground level movements, like I mentioned earlier, on questioning economic policy from the environmental perspective, etc. So we have some elements of that, but not really a full-fledged program. So the third major one which we have now is alternatives. So we have conservation and livelihoods, education, environmental education, and now the focus on alternatives, which I can describe in more detail. So these are the three thematic areas, main thematic areas. And the kinds of work we do are outreach and education, networking, visualization of both the problems and the alternatives through websites or publications, ground level support, including where necessary support, legal support, or other kinds of support to ground level movements of peoples, global networking. So these are sort of methods that we use to take these thematic areas forward.
Fantastic. Brilliant. I want to ask you a little bit about the concept of development and how Kalpavriksh approaches this idea, but I'd like to sort of ground and frame the discussion in the context of a specific case that you're working in. So the situation, based off your website, the situation in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands sort of stood out to me, but I'm happy if you want to discuss a different case where this idea of development is coming into conflict with environmental and social well-being. So how do you view that whole dynamic?
Maybe I should take two, because they're very different contexts and they bring out different lessons. So one, which I mentioned already, is the Narmada, what's called the Narmada River Valley Development Project, which is 30 big dams in one river basin, one river and all its tributaries. And that's something we started working in 1983, as I mentioned, with the Trek 50-day walk along the river, and then bringing out a report, and then joining the People's Movement when it started in 1985. Now, why the question development or destruction was the following. One, does it really make sense to displace 100,000 people or 200,000 people in order to provide water, even if supposing the water is being provided to 1 million people, so 10 times more than what's being displaced, which is how the government was just justifying it. To us, it doesn't make sense that you have to disempower a large number of people to be able to provide water to, let's say, even a larger number of people. That's a sort of a trade-off kind of a view of development which we don't accept. So that's one thing, because we're saying, okay, who's getting the benefits, who's losing out has to be questioned. Who takes decisions on who gets displaced and who gets the benefits has to be asked. This question has to be asked. Are those 100,000 people who are being displaced, have they ever been consulted? Do they, for instance, do they want to say that there are other ways by which you can provide water to those million people without displacing us? Have even the million people who are being supposedly benefited, have many of them been asked this question, that do you want 100,000 people to be displaced for your water? No? And many of them might say, no, sorry, we don't accept that. That's not ethically correct for us. So issues of democracy, issues of trade-offs, these were very clear. But the other thing that was important, and of course, part of this is not just displacement, but also the destruction of an entire riverine ecosystem, all the forests along it, the river ecology, the animals in it, a particular fish called hilsa, which is endangered, would have been further endangered, the crocodile, Narmada crocodile. And incidentally, the crocodile is the vehicle of the goddess Reva, or the goddess Narmada. Right. So here, there's also spiritual questions. In fact, spiritual questions were also important because this river is considered by people in central India to be even more sacred than the Ganga. The Ganges, which the whole world knows as a sacred river, also one of the most polluted, by the way. This river is considered to be even more sacred. And there's an ancient, probably a few thousand years of practice of people walking barefoot 2,600 kilometers along the river as part of a pilgrimage, right? Which a practice that's now destroyed because a few dams have already come up there. Anyway, so there were all these issues, and along with that, we were saying, well, look, if you do alternative ways of providing water, decentralized water harvesting and management, not focusing on water guzzling crops like sugarcane and tobacco and so on, but saying, okay, if these are somewhat water, there's less rainfall in these areas where the water is supposed to be taken by these dams and canals, what would be a cropping pattern that would be appropriate there where farmers could still do well? And in fact, traditionally, that is what has been happening. So what we are saying is that it's not just unfair that you are causing this kind of devastation, but you don't need to do it because the same million people or 2 million people could be provided adequate water through alternative means. And so part of the work was also to connect with groups that were already doing that kind of work in the same areas where the Narmada water was to be taken. So this question of development and destruction therefore becomes very relevant there. We're not simply saying no, no, no. We're saying, but there are other answers in which these trade-offs are not necessary, right? And that's our focus also, which I'll talk about later, on all areas of human activity, not just on water or electricity. So that's one example. The second example, which you mentioned rightly, is we've been working for the last more than 2 decades on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is the southernmost part of India, almost touching Southeast Asia. This is a group of islands that is ecologically and culturally very, very interesting. Before more recent settlement in the last 150 years, partly during the British colonial period, this was an area which had 5 indigenous peoples, right? Both what could be called Mongoloid and Negroid, if one wants to use those slightly outdated terms. But these were people who've been there for thousands of years. And so they were the original inhabitants. Now, what happens during British time and subsequently is that more and more people from the mainland of India are settled into these islands, including by displacing some of these indigenous tribes, including by spreading disease and causing deaths of tens of thousands of people, kind of similar to what happened in the Americas in the colonial conquest. And then more recently, bringing in the mainstream models of development. The latest project, which I have actually personally filed a case against, is in the Great Nicobar, which is the southernmost island of this group of islands, where a national park of forests that have never actually been used by human beings, except a little bit by the local indigenous people, being deregulated or taken off the books. A tribal reserve for the same indigenous peoples being partially taken off, removed, for a multi infrastructure project, a port, shipment facility, township, etc., resort, and stuff like that. And the government of India is promoting it as a kind of an alternative to, let's say, Singapore or places like that, and are saying a lot of people will come there. Shipping facilities will be opened up, so ships that have to travel through across the Indian Ocean, they can actually dock there, and etc. The ecological cost is immense. The social cost is immense because indigenous people will lose these lands. And there's a lot of risk because that's exactly the area where during the tsunami a decade back, land actually subsided significantly. It's exactly where these projects are coming up. And the question is being asked, what happens if there's another tsunami? What then with all this massive cost infrastructure that's built up kind of basically just sinks into the ocean? Anyway, so these are all questions. There's a colleague of mine in Kalpavriksh, Pankaj Sukseria, who's been following and tracking these events over the last 20 years in the islands. And in this particular case, a lot of solid documentation that he's built up, based on which I filed a petition some months back. Yeah. So again, question: who is this for? I mean, what are the profits? Where are the revenues going to go? If it's not for the local people, and if it is ecologically so dubious, is this really development? And if really we want revenues and revenues to go to, say, the poorest people of India, then there's a whole bunch of other alternatives that doesn't require this kind of very stupid, it's sort of blatantly stupid project.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about alternatives. I sort of want to shift a bit towards the bigger picture now. I heard you on another podcast recently talking about a concept called eco-Swaraj, which I think you translated as radical ecological democracy. Could you explain what that is?
Sure. So I think, firstly to say that this is not necessarily anything dramatically new that I've evolved. It's emerged from learnings from communities on the ground, both in India and also outside India. Indigenous peoples or other communities who are actually saying that, look, we don't want, enough is enough. We don't want this kind of development. For us, what we want is well-being, satisfaction, happiness. We want good food. We want safe drinking water. We want good livelihoods. We want good avenues of education, health. That's what we want, right? Now, we think that there are other ways to do this compared to the mainstream destructive ways of doing it. So there's like 5 different elements to this that we have been working on. One is, of course, the most fundamental is ecology, that you work with nature and with the earth and with seeds and with forests and whatever your natural ecosystems are, not against them, not thinking of them as barriers or things you have to sort of get rid of to develop. Secondly, that you build on your own systems of knowledge and culture. And you take what is good from outside. Let's take medicine, right? So India has some fantastic traditional medicinal systems, a whole diversity of them. But then the government comes in with saying that, no, the only system that's relevant is allopathy, Western medicine, and it pushes that all across India. And so many of these movements, the health movements, for instance, are saying that, no, we need both. We're not saying no to allopathy. Sometimes it's useful, but let's also build on our own existing systems. The same thing could be with language, which could be with food. What's happening in many parts of the world, including in India, is diseases caused by affluence, by fast food, by junk food, right? So movements are saying, let's actually revisit our own foods and the balances that were built into our culinary systems and cuisines. And we don't actually say no to all modern foods, but what would be an appropriate mix for that? So then you bring in culture and society and social issues and knowledge issues and so on. But then these movements are also saying that We can't do all this unless we have both political and economic power. So then you start asking the question, who is taking decisions, for whom, and at whose cost, right? So there are movements across the world, including in India, saying that democracy is about us taking decisions where we are, not a government, not private sector, not bureaucrats, not politicians. So that's why direct or radical democracy, that is to say, power at the roots. Each one of us is born with that power. How do we exercise that? But how do we also exercise that with responsibility? So the notion of Swaraj, let me come to the notion of Swaraj in a minute. So that's about power. But then also saying that even if we have political power on the ground, if the resources or the economic means of production and consumption are not in our hands, then what is the point of political power? So therefore, land, forests, machinery, tools, technologies, these need to be also democratically controlled. So the struggle for then retaining or reclaiming collective rights over forests, which I described earlier with regard to the Forest Rights Act, or the struggles of workers to have some level of control over production process, the consumer struggles to have some level of say and control in what we are consuming and what it's doing to our bodies, but also what it's doing to the environment, why are prices so high, etc. Or for instance, women farmer movements in parts of India saying the seeds that sustain us are ours. They are not some private corporations and they are not the governments. So food sovereignty, for instance. So then the economic controls, but also then thinking of the economy as not just money, not just financial exchanges, but relations of caring and sharing, right? So these same women farmers will be saying, we will never sell seeds. Seeds will be freely exchanged with whoever needs them. They're not a commercial entity. They're not a commodity. They are a sacred, they have their own spirit. They are sacred. The earth is sacred. We won't sell it. But we will make sure that everybody has it and everybody then has food security and food sovereignty, right? So then thinking of the economy also well beyond finance and money. And finally, social justice. Because in so many parts of the world, either as traditional systems or as new systems, there are inequalities, there are deprivations, there's exploitation. I mentioned earlier gender and caste, which in India are very old systems of inequality and deprivation. So the struggles for equality, the struggles for removing casteism, the struggles for equality between genders, the struggles for LGBTQ plus to gain the rights that and the respect that they need, etc. All of that comes in. And sorry, I forgot to mention in the ecological context also that as we struggle for human rights, also then respecting the rights of other species and the rest of nature and land and forests and rivers and mountains, etc. So you put all of these things together into what we call a flower of transformation with these 5 petals, the political, social, cultural, ecological, and economic. And you center them on a set of values, solidarity, diversity, generosity, interconnectedness, human rights, but also the rights of nature, etc. Then we emerge with something called eco-Swaraj or radical ecological democracy. Let me just quickly explain Swaraj. The word Swaraj comes from, it's a very ancient Indian word. It essentially means self-determination or self-rule or autonomy, freedom. And when it kind of became very prominent during the struggle of India to gain independence from British colonial rule, Mahatma Gandhi actually popularized it, but he was very careful to point that Swaraj is therefore not just about India's independence from British colonial rule. That's important, but that's not the only thing. In fact, he said that we will never have Swaraj if we don't also have freedom from our social evils, freedom to determine our own pathways of well-being, and restraints so that my freedom doesn't become something that undermines your freedom. My communities and your communities, my countries and your countries, etc. And in fact, here, very, very interesting line there. He said that somebody asked him what he thinks about Western model of development. And he said, look, if India was to take the same pathway that Britain has done, Britain's already destroyed half the world. If India was to do that with its population, etc., we will strip the world bare like locusts. That's his famous words, right? So in that sense, he was saying that Swaraj for me is also about responsibility to the rest of the world. We have a couple of us writing on this have just coined the word eco Swaraj to say responsibility toward not just other people, but also the rest of nature. So essentially, that's it. And radical democracy means to the roots, power with us, but also roots, our own cultural roots, our ecological roots, etc. Sorry, that was a bit long as an explanation, but that's what it is.
No, that was excellent. I'd like to sort of bring in the dynamic of population into this discussion. How do you see the transition to eco-Swaraj unfolding? And I guess I'm particularly thinking of the tens of millions of people living in slums in India. And obviously the current system isn't working for these people either. But these sort of incredibly densely populated areas, what would eco-Swaraj look like for them?
Yeah, I mean that is of course a serious issue, but I think the one has to ask this question: why has this kind of dense population happened in the first place? The density of population, whether in some of our cities or some parts of rural India also, and of course there are many historical factors involved, but two that I would like to point out which are important because there's nothing natural about them. One is a lot more focus on urban expansion, urban development, facilities in urban areas, etc., than in rural areas. This is exactly what Gandhiji had warned. He had said, if you do that, you're going to create more and more and more poverty and deprivation and so on, and you're going to basically disempower rural India. And that's what's been happening. So people in villages don't have enough livelihoods. There are older issues of casteism and other forms of deprivation. Economic jobs are not available, etc., because of these sorts of urban-centered policies. So, of course, they're going to pour into cities. And when they pour into cities in these sort of large numbers, there is no way that the cities can cope. And therefore, the slums or the squatter settlements and the lack of facilities and all of that, right? So that's one big issue. The second one is a social one, which is the patriarchal system that we have, which for a lot of Indians, it's important to have a son because the son is the one who's going to perform your last rites when you die, etc., etc. I mean, there's a whole bunch of religious issues involved here. And also because women rarely have had a say in how many kids should be produced, even though the woman is the one bearing the children, but she doesn't have a say in that. And so this gender inequality and mixed up with sort of religious aspects is one of the biggest reasons also why this push for more and more and more children, because sometimes the couple will have 3 girls and they'll still want a 4th one to see if they can get a boy. So these two, but there are so many other factors, but these ones, and of course poverty, because poverty means the more children you have, the more people who might be able to support you when you grow old, right? Especially if you have a boy or a few boys. So all of these put together is what's caused the issues now. So therefore, if one wants to tackle this, you have to be able to tackle these factors, the social, economic, political factors that I just spoke about. We have examples in India where villages that have been able to revitalize their economies, create good education and health facilities, are villages where no longer are people moving out. In fact, those who had moved out are actually moving back. There's a reverse migration taking place. Now, supposing this happened all across India with some kind of public support, you would actually find that cities would not be as crowded anymore. People living in slums, really facing the worst living conditions, might have the incentives of actually even going back to their village if they had those sorts of economic and social opportunities. That's one crucial. The second is gender empowerment, women's empowerment, to be able to say, no, we want, okay, 1 child or 2 child, I don't want 6 or 10. But also all the other sort of social issues involved with that. So an example of that is Kerala in South India, which has had this kind of policy for a long time, and you find that birth rates there are much less than in many other parts of the country. So these things need to be looked at. Finally, one very important issue is consumerism. So you could have the most densely populated part of the country, like say urban slum, but their impact on the environment would be almost nothing compared to 1/10 of the population in one of India's richest city colonies, for instance, right? We know now, in fact, that sometimes the richest have maybe 40 times the ecological or the climate impacts that the poorest have. So therefore, the whole issue of inequality of living, inequality of opportunities, inequality of consumption patterns, etc., also has to be brought into the picture. So demography is one aspect, but it's just one of many factors, and I would not even say the most important one that we have to look at if you want to solve our problems.
Fantastic.
Oh, sorry, and I should also quickly mention that even in these densely populated pockets, we find that people are finding solutions. For instance, for housing, in slums, you mentioned slums, right? Slums, one of the worst things is housing or water. We have an amazing example in, for instance, this city of Bhuj in Western India, where some civil society organizations and local people have worked together to replan the entire neighborhood and become from a slum to become a very dignified housing colony with their own ways of creating the houses, planning the water, self-reliance and things like that. So it is possible to actually transform even these densely populated pockets if one has that kind of approach.
Brilliant. One more question at that sort of big picture level. A few years ago, you and some friends put together a book called Pluriverse, which I've just started reading, and I love the idea of this book. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so the idea is that, I've been off and on mentioning in the last hour about alternatives. And I think one of the sort of mistakes that we make, and certainly governments and corporations and sometimes big NGOs also make, is to say, oh, this is a fantastic solution. Let's upscale it. Let's replicate it everywhere. Typically, to give you an example, in Maharashtra, in the state that I live in Western India, one village called Ralegan Siddhi showed a way by which the village could be revitalized. And in fact, it's one of the examples of what I said earlier of reverse migration, people coming back because the village has, it's a thriving economy and there's a really good school and all of that. So the government of Maharashtra said, oh, fantastic, let's replicate this for all villages across the state. And they had a scheme called the Adarsh Gaon Yojana, or the Model Village Scheme. And they put tons of money into it. And it failed because there was no process that was involved in building the capacity in each of these villages. There was no thinking of saying, okay, how is this village different from that one? And so therefore, what modifications are needed in the program, etc. So this approach of replication or of upscaling, that you have something that's good, make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Typical corporate way of looking at things, and some NGOs also. So instead of that, what we're saying is that, look, every area is unique. It has some similarity with another area, but it has its own characteristics, ecologically, economically, socially, culturally, etc. And so if you come up with a solution that is fantastic, instead of trying to copy it exactly, I learn from you the lessons of what you have done, the values and principles that you have used. Then using that, I adopt my own, adapt it and make my own approach. And then I try and do something. And then I connect with you to create scale at a horizontal level, which means that there is no universal solution. The concept of university is itself problematic because students are being taught exactly that this is what is development, this is what is art, this is what is economy, and everything else is nonsense. So from there, we say, no, we have a pluriverse. Your universe is different from my universe. Your world is different from my world. It's pluriversal, therefore, right? Plurality. But we also have connections, which could be, as I said, values. You might also believe in solidarity. I would also believe in solidarity. The reflections of what that means in our lives could be different, but we believe in some fundamental values and ethics and principles. So for us, scale is neither upscaling nor replication, but what I call outscaling. So you believe in this pluriverse of ideologies, worldviews, economies, cultures, languages, foods, etc., etc., and then you link up through the common threads and values, and you create that kind of scale by this kind of horizontal networking and linking. This is exactly what we're trying through some of the networks that I mentioned earlier. So that's what is pluriverse, and it doesn't mean that therefore everything is so unique that you have no way of connecting with each other. But it definitely doesn't mean that you have to copy what I'm doing or I have to copy what you're doing. and then we become one big global organization. So this also has implications for what would global governance look like, for instance. It actually has implications for even the nation state as a governance system. Many of us believe that the nation state is not fit for purpose as a governance system. Because if you really believe in radical democracy, you're talking about peoples of the earth who are doing whatever they have to do or can do in an autonomous way, but then linking up with respect to interdependence. And then you don't need the sort of centralized nation state. But then if you don't need a centralized nation state, what about the United Nations? What would a global governance system look like? And that's where we say, well, the UN has been very useful in many respects, like some of the international human rights treaties and environmental treaties and so on. But it's also a failure because it depends on nation states, as you see right now with what's happening in Palestine or what's happening in Ukraine or whatever, right? Or with the climate crisis. And so what we need at a global governance level is peoples of the earth. I don't know, nobody knows exactly what that will look like, but it's where indigenous peoples can represent themselves, communities can represent themselves. It doesn't have to depend on their national governments. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things. And I think one, as I mentioned earlier, also that the political boundaries that cut ecological flows and cultural flows also have to be challenged. And we have to start, for instance, with South Asia, start thinking of what would South Asia look like politically if these political boundaries didn't exist. Could the Gangetic Plains be governed as a single unit? Could the Sundarbans mangrove forests, the largest mangrove forests in the world, which are currently cut between India and Bangladesh, could they be governed as a single political, cultural, ecological unit, etc.? So there are things like this that we have to think about.
Just quickly on that, within your pluriverse, what values and rights are universalizable? What is universal within the pluriverse?
Well, I mean, I think we can certainly borrow from both the UN Declaration on Human Rights and the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to see, because those are things that have come from mass movements, people's movements, right, and supported by some nation states, but essentially coming from struggles on the ground, is that there are some fundamental things that, I mean, for instance, protection against violence is universal, right? Not just physical violence, but violence in terms of, say, verbal violence or religious violence or whatever. The right to profess one's own faith without undermining somebody else's. The rights of all species to exist and survive. I think these, I mean, I can go on and on, but these are some of the sorts of, in a sense, universals. But I think what's very important is that that universal can be reflected and manifested on the ground in different ways. It doesn't look exactly the same. Gender rights may not look exactly the same everywhere. This has been one of the sort of things that a lot of global South feminist movements have questioned the Western feminist movement, right, about. Or nature rights may not necessarily look exactly the same. In some places, people might still have the right to hunt, but they have a respect for nature. In other places, people might say, okay, no, we're going to stop all hunting for whatever reasons, right? And you respect both ways of doing it. So, yeah, the manifestations could be different, but there are some things that I think we could all agree on.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm a big fan of this worldview. Thanks for sharing. I'd like to shift focus to you as an individual now, if that's all right. What was your upbringing like? Were your family quite passionate about environmental and social issues as well? And yeah, what was that period?
Well, I have to say I was lucky that my father, he was a political scientist, and he was very much not just a pure academic, but an academic activist, so also very involved with political struggles in India, human rights struggles, for instance, as was my oldest brother. And another older brother, but also my mother, who was, one can say, a housemaker, was also a teacher of children who were children of street workers who had no other way to go to school. So there was something called mobile creches in New Delhi, and she would go and teach there. And she was also, in her own way, very strong on issues of fundamental ethics. Some of which probably also came from the religion she grew up in. It's a small religion in India called Jainism. Very fundamental ethics of respect for all life and things like that. I think my vegetarianism sort of comes from her. My sensibility on human rights probably comes from my both mother and father. But environment, it's a sort of strange way, came to me on its own. I don't think either of my parents. I mean, they were ecologically conscious without thinking of it in a conscious way, right? Because we were always told not to waste anything, for instance. And we weren't told that don't waste anything because it's environmentally important, but just don't waste. It's unethical. But to me, I think it first started with I love dogs and cats, and beginning to see the kind of pain that was being inflicted on animals. I mentioned monkey exports from India to the US, which was one of the first things we protested against. I read an article and saw pictures of how monkeys were treated in these horrible experiments of all kinds in the US. And that kind of something turned in me saying that no, we can't treat animals in this way just for our benefit or our pleasure. And so I became an animal rights activist in high school, and then from there the rest of the journey was really not that difficult. If I just opened my mind and my eyes and ears, then all the other connections actually started happening. I got interested in bird watching. I was in high school. I was in a nature club, and we went to a couple of bird sanctuaries, and it just blew my mind. The diversity of birds was just so incredible that I became a very avid bird watcher. And from there, larger and larger issues. So I should say I was lucky to be able to be exposed to all these sorts of things.
Yeah, it sounds like you had some great role models in your family. Who were your other key role models and influences when you were younger? Was there an important teacher who inspired you, or a public figure that you looked up to?
Well, I guess several. Some would have been figures of history, which I would never have personally interacted with, like Gandhi, for instance. As you know, somebody who influenced both my parents, but also, and my father was involved in the independence movement very strongly, including with Gandhi. And so that in some way, reading a little bit about it, hearing about him, etc., including his views on environment, was obviously one influence. Others were much more closely at home, I would say. Others were the movements I mentioned. Chipko movement, for instance, was a very, very inspiring thing for me to hear about the fact that women, completely so-called illiterate, uneducated women, were protecting trees up in the Himalaya, including by risking their own lives, by hugging the trees, was, for me, that was really quite incredible. But that was without naming anybody. I didn't know them. Then finally, in 1979 and 80, we visited some of those areas, and I got to know some of those activists. Back home in India itself, I mean, in my own immediate things, the nature club that I joined was started by an older colleague called Mahendra Vyas, and Mahendra, the way he explained nature and then took us out on field trips and all of that, that was very inspiring. So there's a bunch of them. I would say that no one single role model that I can kind of think of. Many.
Brilliant. You've worked in a lot of different areas over your career, from sort of grassroots people's movements in India through to international organizations like the IUCN and Greenpeace. How do you decide what to focus your attention on at any given time? And I guess more specifically, how do you think about top-down versus bottom-up approaches to enacting change?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because at any given point of time, there's 100 things one would like to work on. And there's fires burning all over the place, especially these days, literally and figuratively. So I guess especially in the last 15, 20 years, I've kind of decided that even as I continue supporting the firefighting, I want to be able to take time off and work on positive stuff, on alternatives. And this means looking at what's happening on the ground, supporting that, writing about it, but also doing my own reflections on what's happening, and then trying to see what are the sort of big picture that's emerging. And that's how eco-Swaraj, radical ecological democracy, kind of, in a sense, emerged. And secondly, I think it's absolutely crucial. This is a fundamental philosophy we've had right from the beginning, that we can't do things alone. As an individual or as an organization, we need to network. We need to link up with other groups, other people, in order to actually create some kind of a critical mass. So networking and being respectful networkers, that is to say, however small an organization or an individual, however supposedly insignificant the work, it's as important as a big one. And to me, sort of respectful of different ways of working, scales, etc. This, I think, has also been a focus. So thinking of these 2, 3 things, I think it becomes a bit easier than to say, okay, this is what I want to focus on and not that. But it's a constant, it's almost a daily choice one has to make. Okay, so should I do something about Palestine? I don't know what to do. Should I do something about the struggles, the conflicts that are happening, or the disasters like the one I described earlier about the tunnel collapse and the workers being stuck there? Or should I continue doing what I'm doing right now and say, well, other people will probably handle that? It's basically a daily choice, really.
Yeah, and it is a tough balance to strike, I suppose. What advice would you give to a young person who's interested in doing the kind of work that you do? So I'm thinking high school, maybe early university age, or even younger.
Well, I don't know about advice. I can only say what I've learned. One is never think of yourself as too small to make change. And this is a very big issue for a lot of young people that I speak to. They feel that the macro issue is just so big. The crises are so big. Climate crisis is so big. There's nothing I can do. And I think that's a big mistake. As an individual, as a small group, there's a lot one can do in one's own individual lives, consumption, etc., but also with groups in your own social economic setup, and then linking with others, like I said. So one is never think of yourself as too small. Secondly, never give up hope. This is another big issue. The younger generation today is so frustrated and feeling so helpless and hopeless, including what I learn or read about now, clinical depression because of the climate crisis. People think it's all gone, it's finished. That for me, people know about and get connected to transformations that are taking place on the ground, which are giving us hope. That, okay, we're not going to be able to avert all the collapse. Some is happening, more will happen. But if we focus on these seeds of hope, then hopefully we have them around when more and more people start looking for answers and solutions. These are still around for us to be able to build on. So never, I think, lose hope. The third thing I would say is never be scared to have your voice being heard. That's another thing that's happening in so many countries in the world. There's authoritarian governments. There is repression, including in India, and a lot of people have gone quiet. And of course, strategically, you might say that I'm going to be quiet for 2 months or whatever, but I think becoming permanently quiet is just not an option. It's not a choice. We have to speak up in whatever way we can. It could be as a cartoon, it could be as a poem, it could be as a singer, it could be as an article writer or an activist out in the streets or whatever. Different forms of making your voice heard. And fourth, if one does all of this and there's a passion to do something, it's always possible to make a livelihood out of it. You may not earn huge amounts of money. You won't reach Forbes 500 list or whatever. But having enough to go by and live relatively okay lives, not super comfort, but not discomfort either, is always possible. So don't think that environmental activism or human rights activism or human rights journalism or environmental journalism, etc., is not an option, an economic option also, I think it is. So yeah, these 4 things. This is not advice. It's just, I think, what I've learned in my life.
Those are all really beautiful lessons. Thank you for that. I want to ask you about your toughest, most challenging day or experience working for Kalpavriksh. And I also want to ask you about your best, most rewarding day or experience. And I'll let you decide which one you want to speak about first.
That's a tough one. I have to go back to 45 years of 45 is into 365 days to try and figure out which is. Oh gosh. So I think in terms of toughest days, being involved in the movement against the big dams in Narmada River, which I had described earlier, there were situations and occasions when we would be threatened by people, supporters of the dam, or threatened by the police with action, and either being detained or in some way or the other kind of harassed. And so there have been a few days of that kind where one is a little worried for one's own safety and security. Though fortunately, I've never really been physically attacked or imprisoned, but these threats have always been there. And there's a few days I can think of where it was much higher. In terms of inspiring days, wow. Gosh, how many? It's just thousands. I think maybe the first time I sat with the women of the Chipko movement when we went on a trek into the Himalaya in 1979-80. First time when I sat with them and I heard their very earthy, very down to earth, very earthy wisdom of why they wanted to protect trees, I was really just blown away. Because for me, all the scientific ecological arguments and all that is important. They became really secondary to just this very earthy wisdom of this is the earth, this is the land, the trees are our brothers. Why? How can we allow them to be cut? That's one. And the second, I think, is many, many, many instances of connect with nature, the rest of nature. And again, that can go back all the 45 years. But I think I had a recent experience that I was so incredibly touched by. It stayed, and I think it will stay the rest of my life. I was down in Kerala near a waterfall, and there was a group of monkeys. And I was looking at them. There was one baby monkey that was looking at me. I was looking at it. We were obviously curious about each other. And I kind of hesitatingly reached out. Hesitatingly because these monkeys can also sometimes be aggressive. They can scratch. And the mother was also around, and she might think I was threatening the baby. So I kind of just reached out, and the baby monkey just bent down, smelt my fingers, and then reached out and touched me with its fingers. Now, this is a wild monkey, right? This is not a domestic one. And it was like for 2 or 3 seconds. And I was like, wow, a connection that is a few seconds, but encompasses a whole, millions of years of evolution and our fundamental connect with all life. That happened. And I think that's going to stay forever for me.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. We're almost done, but I have a couple of quick fire questions that I like to ask everyone. Are you keen for that?
Mm-hmm.
All right. You're allowed to pick one person, living or dead, and you get to live their entire life from start to finish. So you pause your life right now, you live their entire life experiencing everything they experienced, and then you come back to your life with all of their memories. Who do you choose?
I think Mohandas Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi would be the one.
Why is that?
Incredible life. Well, just an incredible life of constant trials, explorations, doing things physically, what you're trying to promote intellectually or emotionally, living through one of the most intense struggles that India has ever known, not just the independence movement, but also struggles against inequality and so on. And becoming a figure that continues to inspire movements all over the world. So, yeah, I don't think I ever could become like him, but I'm just saying if I had the choice, yes.
Brilliant. All right, question 2. You wake up tomorrow and you find you've been elected Prime Minister of India. You've got full power and everyone's supportive of what you're doing, so you don't need to compromise to win votes or anything like that. What's the first thing that you do?
Well, I'm glad you added that I don't need to compromise and everybody's supporting. In that case, I would fundamentally alter our economic policies. I would give much more power to the village assemblies and urban neighborhoods for being able to decide their own things, but also encourage them to link up with neighbors so that they're also thinking bioregionally and not just their own individual pockets. I would fundamentally alter the economic structures to empower producer companies and cooperatives on the ground to produce almost everything that India needs, which means slowly that even encouraging or discouraging investments by big corporations. And I would start recommoning a lot of our lands, which have become privatized, so bringing them back into the commons. I would put a lot of budgets into the regeneration of our land and natural resources. There's a lot of degradation that's gone in, and that also provides huge employment opportunities, this kind of regeneration. I would bring back policies for supporting handmade products, handicrafts or crafts, because at some point in time we may have had 150 to 200 million people actually employed in those, and to bring those back, and the whole incredible knowledge and diversity of skills and technologies that are involved. And I would request all the modern science and technology institutions to support these sorts of things, rather than think of their own pathways and their own profits and their own power. And so therefore to say that yes, modern technology and modern science, yes, but in the service of all of humanity and in the service of the rest of nature. So yeah, this is some of it. I don't know, there's a lot more, of course, that one would have to build. I would give a lot more attention to dignifying the livelihoods of those who live undignified livelihoods, like our so-called Dalits or so-called untouchables, the people who do manual scavenging, the people who are still having to basically live extreme lives of drudgery and non-dignity. So to give them much more dignified livelihoods. I put a lot more resources into villages, what I mentioned earlier, trying to revitalize villages so that in fact a lot of people from cities could go back to them. And I would build much more relationships, international or global relationships of strengthening peace and ecological security and so on, including supporting the struggles of those who are occupied and against whom wars are being waged, such as right now Palestine or Ukraine. Yeah, that's quite a wish list.
That's not bad for a first day. You've got my vote. Have you ever thought about pursuing politics?
I have thought about it, and I've also thought that I probably would not want to become that, because I would probably have to compromise a lot just to be able to stay as Prime Minister. So that's why I said I'm glad you added that caveat in the middle. Without that, it would be. And so I actually have a problem with this form of democracy anyway. I mean, ideally, there would be no Prime Minister. You would have a non-centralized state system, such as what the Kurdish movement or the Zapatista have been trying.
Two more questions. Firstly, what are some other organizations that inspire you and whose work you admire?
In India, I think there's well, again, I mean, there's so much of a choice. As I said, I mean, I think a lot of the people's movements on the ground, like the Narmada movement for a few decades, but also movements like the small-scale fisheries, fish workers movement, the movements of waste pickers and other unorganized labor movements, which kind of struggle in the most difficult of situations. So these are some, and we're lucky that we kind of connected with a lot of these through our national network called Vikalp Sangam, or the Alternatives Confluence also. Globally, I would say that the especially two that are very inspiring for me. One is the Zapatista autonomy movement in Mexico, and the Kurdish freedom movement, the movement for Kurdistan in the sort of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey quarter junction, which again is struggling in one of the most difficult war-ridden areas of the world, struggling to create a ecologically and radical democracy-based society. So yeah, these are a few.
Brilliant. And a final question for you, Ashish. If people were to donate money to Kalpavriksh, what sorts of things would that money go towards?
So we have a completely democratic way of functioning. We have no hierarchies. So basically all the members would decide. So supposing, I don't know, $10,000 was to come in and we were free to do what we wanted with it, then all the members would discuss what to do with it. It could probably go to There are some members, for instance, who do a lot of the work but do it somewhat voluntarily because we don't have enough resources. So it might go to support them, or it might go to support a particular movement that we are supporting right now because there are no resources for it. So yeah, I would find it difficult to say immediately, but basically there would be a process of decision making that would decide what's the priority for something like that.
Brilliant. Well, the idea with this podcast is that every month I want to feature a different not-for-profit organisation, and then I also run a Patreon where people can support the project. So half the money that comes in helps me to keep sharing stories, and then the other half goes directly to the organisations that are featured. So I'll be sending that donation over to Kalpavriksh very shortly. A big thank you to all of the amazing people who support this project, and an even bigger thank you to you, Ashish, for taking the time to chat with me today about all of the incredible work that you're doing. I found it really inspiring. I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Brady. Thanks again for the opportunity. And yeah, we will be in touch. Thank you.
That was Ashish Kothari, founding member of the environmental action group Kalpavriksh. I really loved this conversation, and I found Ashish to be an inspiring individual. He's a deep thinker, unwilling to shy away from the complexity of our global crises, and he's doing his best to unite people to tackle those crises from every angle. As always, I want to discuss 3 key points that Ashish made. And the first is actually a small collection of snippets from the conversation that represents an interesting trend.
So I'm sure other members will have other things to say, but from my perspective, well, I don't know about advice. I can only say what I've learned. We have a completely democratic way of functioning. We have no hierarchies. So basically, all the members would decide.
I mentioned at the start of this podcast that Ashish isn't the director of Kalpavriksh because the organisation doesn't have a director. But it became clear to me over the course of this conversation that this wasn't just an organisational structure, but a philosophy embodied by Ashish that was defined by a deeply ingrained opposition to hierarchies. I'm not sure if he was even aware he was doing it, but there were several times throughout the conversation where Ashish was very careful to stress that he wasn't speaking for the people he was working with, nor telling anyone what to do, but rather leading by example. I don't know, maybe I'm reading into it too much, but with big wins for right-wing populism in the Netherlands and Argentina in the last month, I can't help but feel we're in desperate need of more leaders who stand with the people, not above them. The next point I want to emphasize is this.
1991, it was opened up. We had the so-called economic reforms, which I call deforms. But basically, that meant much more privatization, much more investments by multinational corporations from outside, the possibility for Indian corporations to become very big, much greater or much more relaxation of both human rights and labor and environmental laws that had been hard fought during the 70s and 80s, and a lot more attempt at trying to sell India as a place for commercial and capitalist profit making.
Since 1991, India has seen a significant drop in so-called extreme poverty, those living on less than $2.15 per day. However, the total number of people living below the more tangible poverty line of $6.85 per day has actually increased by around 28% over the same period. And you can listen to my deep dive episode on poverty lines for an explanation of why this is arguably the more important metric. But all of this is despite India's economy growing by over 450% during that same period. The vast majority of India's economic growth in the last 3 decades has been directed towards increasing the wealth of an elite class, and the environmental impacts have been devastating. Since 1990, India has seen the largest increase in absolute deforestation rates of any country in the world, while per capita carbon emissions have almost tripled. Now, I want to stress that India's relative contribution to the climate crisis is still negligible compared to Western nations. my home country of Australia has per capita carbon emissions almost 8 times higher than that of India. The key point, however, is that the economic reforms that India adopted in 1991 in pursuit of unregulated economic growth, the same reforms that much of the world adopted throughout the 80s and 90s, have been responsible for a rampant increase in inequality and huge levels of environmental destruction. The final point I want to talk about is this.
Yeah, that's a difficult one because at any given point of time, there's 100 things one would like to work on. And there's fires burning all over the place, especially these days, literally and figuratively. So I guess especially in the last 15, 20 years, I've kind of decided that even as I continue supporting the firefighting, I want to be able to take time off and work on positive stuff, on alternatives. And this means looking at what's happening on the ground, supporting that, writing about it, but also doing my own reflections on what's happening and then trying to see what are the sort of big picture that's emerging. And that's how eco-swaraj, radical ecological democracy kind of, in a sense, emerged.
I actually want to link this idea back to 2 comments made by the last 2 guests on this podcast. Firstly, there was an interesting similarity between how Ashish described the work of Kalpavriksh and how Chris Catola described Fauna Forever's conservation work in Peru. Chris drew parallels with emergency responders, while Ashish called it firefighting. Then, last month, Olive Moore talked about the importance of maintaining an idealistic vision, but also working pragmatically towards it. And I think this is what Ashish was trying to balance. While he recognizes the importance of supporting the emergency responders and firefighters who are striving for social and environmental justice on the ground, he realizes that we also need people working on that idealistic vision, so that we always have a target or a plurality of targets to aspire towards. If you'd like to support Kalpavriksh, you can donate to them directly by visiting kalpavriksh.org/donate. You can also follow them on Facebook, and Ashish is on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. On behalf of all the amazing people who support this project, I was able to make a donation of $100 to Kalpavriksh. If you'd like to help me give more money to more amazing NGOs in the future, please consider signing up to the Patreon via the link in the show notes for as little as $5 a month. In the show notes, you'll also find further information about a range of topics that Ashish and I discussed during this conversation. Another big thank you to everyone who supports this podcast and to Ashish Kothari for being keen to chat with me about the incredible work of him and his team. I hope you found Kalpavriksh as inspiring as I did, and I'll see you next month for another episode of Protect the World.